Welcome. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. In this part, we're going to bring on a Nobel Prize winner. We're very delighted to have with us Dr. Gerald Edelman, winner of the Nobel Prize specializing in brain science. So we're going to talk about some of the greatest mysteries in science, especially the science of the human brain. Now, it's hard to conceptualize the fact that perhaps the most complex object in the known universe, the most complex object that science knows about, is the human brain. And only within the last 10, 15 years has physics allowed us to probe deeply into the nature of thinking itself. Using physics and MRI machines, we can actually see thoughts ricocheting inside the human mind. And so with us today is Dr. Gerald Edelman, who will present his theory of consciousness, one of the great frontiers in science. In fact, I think perhaps the two greatest mysteries in all of nature is the origin of the universe and the origin of the human mind. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest today. We're very glad to have with us a Nobel laureate. That's right, a Nobel laureate who is now specializing on trying to unravel the secrets of the brain. We're talking to Dr. Gerald Edelman, winner of the Nobel Prize and author of a new book on the human brain called Second Nature, Brain Science and Human Knowledge. So believe it or not, sitting on your shoulders is perhaps the most complex object known to science out to trillions of miles, out to the nearest star. And yet we know so little about its inner workings. And yet Dr. Edelman has proposed a new theory of consciousness, and a new theory of brain science. So once again, today we are talking about the frontiers of brain research with a Nobel laureate, Dr. Gerald Edelman. The first question for you is, as a youth, how did you first get interested in science?
Well, I was, in fact, most interested in music, and, in fact, trained to become a concert violinist.
Oh, is that right?
Of course, at that stage of the game, I did fool around a bit. For example, I tried to make a welding machine out of a woman's hair curler, a brazing rod, and some nichrome wire for resistance. Mm-hmm. And I knew Ohm's law, but when I plugged it in, I almost blew up the house in terms of bypassing all the circuit breakers. My father was not pleased.
I see.
I had some interest, in other words, in gadgets, but that wasn't really the incentive. What happened after I did actually get to the point of playing recitals is I realized that I wasn't a performer, that I wasn't interested in energizing the occasion. I was interested in the music. So I thought I'd compose, but then it turned out I had no gift whatsoever. My father was a doctor, and I thought, well, maybe what I could do is some kind of research. And I thought research was medical research, and that drove me in that direction.
And that eventually led to the Nobel Prize.
Well, yes, it's a long eventually. What happened, in fact, is I became interested in studying immunity and the fundamental molecule of immunity, which was called gamma globulin in those days. It's called immunoglobulin today. It's a molecule that recognizes foreign molecules that come into your body, either from viruses or bacteria or anything. And my group and I solved the entire chemical structure of immunoglobulin, and that led eventually to the award of the Nobel Prize.
And that was an amazing discovery, right? Helping to unlock one of the most complex molecular systems of the body, the human immune system.
Yes, of course, there were other people who had sketched out the image of the thing, but this work gave it a kind of, how shall I say, concreteness, since, in fact, the molecular structure was the clue to how the whole system worked.
Okay. Well, since you're an expert in the biomolecular chemistry of the immune system, what then prompted you to make the leap into the whole question of the brain and consciousness?
Well, it wasn't a leap, it was a slide. In fact, I would like to say that every event of my life is more characterized by that metaphor than by a leaping. In any case, what happened is after I solved that structure, and gave good reason to back up the idea of how the immune system works, which is an interesting thing in itself we might discuss, I decided to work in developmental biology, and I started to work on the retina of the eye and the brain. And we dissected retinae out of chick embryos to solve the problem of how cells stick together, the different nerve cells or neurons. How does one recognize another and stick together to make a tissue? And in the course of that, we discovered what are called cell adhesion molecules, which are a very interesting thing in themselves. They, in fact, had the same kind of structure as antibodies. That was not prefigured in anything we did. At that point, I became more and more interested in the brain and the idea of recognition. Immune molecules recognize foreign molecules, but of course there's no thinking involved. So I sort of said, well, maybe we should look into how the brain actually works and how it recognizes how you perform acts of perception and memory and feeling and that kind of thing. So I sort of slid into it.
Okay. And speaking about brain research, which goes, of course, way back centuries, there's been a polarized debate between at least two camps. One is a so-called dualist camp that says that perhaps physical forces are not the only ones involved, that perhaps mind is something beyond physical forces. And then we have the other camp, which is more reductionist, which says that, well, the brain is a bunch of neurons, and if you pile up all these neurons together, perhaps you can understand consciousness and thinking. But what are your thoughts now about the philosophy toward the brain?
Well, let me start again, if I'm not too pedantic about it, with the great French philosopher René Descartes, philosopher and mathematician, who in his search for absolute certainty of knowledge said, I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. In French, je pense donc je suis. And he decided that, in fact, the world was divided into two kinds of substances. Extended things, res extensa, which physics could examine and science could examine, and res cogitans, which didn't have any time or space. And thus he began the whole notion of dualism. And that is the notion that, in fact, consciousness is not connected directly to the workings of the brain, but exists in an entire sphere inaccessible to science. Clearly, as a scientist, I don't agree with that notion. Of course, when you disagree with a genius like René Descartes, you wish you could play his wrong notes. So I am definitely of the opinion that consciousness arises as a result of the workings of the brain, particularly of a specific part of the brain, specific different parts of the brain, which we might be able to discuss.
Okay, now some people claim that we are at the brink of a revolution in brain science because of instruments like brain scans, MRI, CAT scans, that allow us to see the thinking brain in motion. We have indirect measurements of blood flow and other functions of the thinking brain, the living thinking brain, that for the first time in history allows us to see how thoughts move back and forth. Could you elaborate a little bit about these discoveries that are being made almost daily?
Well, these discoveries owe themselves, in fact, to your field to a great extent, to physics. The fact that magnetic resonance imaging can take place, so-called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, allows you to see when a particular nerve area in the living brain without invasion at all, when that particular area is active, it changes the hemoglobin, or the red pigment of your blood, in such a way as to reflect whether it has more or less oxygen, and thus is an indirect indicator of activity of that part of the brain. There's a huge amount of research being done there, and the technique is really marvelous. There's only one problem with it. It is slow. Your neurons fire up very quickly electrically, and this technique will not pick up that, nor will it pick up all the nuances, but nonetheless it's a very important thing to indicate that certain parts of the brain light up in terms of their blood flow when you're thinking about this or doing that or whatever. There's another technique also dependent on physics called magnetoencephalography, which measures non-invasively, again, without going into your head, which measures the actual minute magnetic currents that go along with the electrical currents of the brain. And if you do that in a shielded room, you can see very fast responses, but it isn't as resolved in terms of space. In fact, it can only look at maybe 1 or 2 centimeters of the brain, whereas the other technique could go down to millimeters. So we're looking, of course, finally for a technique that will combine them both. But in the meantime, it's been a very great advance and extremely useful. The problem is not to make the mistake of thinking because an area lights up that it is sufficient for a particular function. For example, if I say when I have someone look at a particular visual image that this area in the back of the brain lights up, that's the way it happened right there. No, it's not the action, it's the interaction, and even fMRI doesn't show all of that.
And as an aside, I should just point out that when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, my boss during my summer job won the Nobel Prize for developing fMRI and MRI technology. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about the structure of the brain now. We look at the gray matter, but of course the scientists over centuries have been able to pick apart the structure and the functions of different parts of the brain. And some people look at the brain via the lens of evolution, that the brain in some sense is a museum of all the previous stages that we've gone through over millions of years, starting with the back of the brain. Could you elaborate the back of the brain, the brainstem? Some people call it the reptilian brain, the oldest part of the brain, and the brain, of course, that is found in reptiles.
Well, yes. Let me first state that at the end of the 19th century was the great flourishing of a field called neuroanatomy, and the greatest of those investigators was Santiago Ramón y Cajal, a Spanish microscopist who worked in Madrid pretty much alone, and he began to tease out all of the different nerve fibers of the brain.
Now, the back of the brain, including the brainstem, is perhaps the oldest part of the brain in terms of evolutionary function, and the front part of our brain and the top part of our brain is perhaps the latest part of our evolution. But what about everything in between? So tell us a little bit about the parts of the human brain.
The brain is a very complex structure. It's probably the most complicated material object in the known physical universe. The fact is it consists of hundreds of different areas and anatomical connections. And, of course, it is a product of evolution. Now, I think the best way to approach this problem is to first give a little sketch of the parts of the brain. The one you mentioned before, the hindbrain, consists of a portion called the pons and the medulla, and something called the spinal cord, which you know about. That's the one which unfortunately gets severed when there's a motorcycle accident or a football crunch and leaves paralysis. There's also a big part of your brain called the cerebellum in the back, which governs the consistency and integration of movements, of fast movements. And finally, there is the center of the brain, which consists of things that also detect movement, but other things that relay signals up to the major portion of the brain, which is so important in human beings, called the cerebral cortex. That's the wrinkled structure that you can see in certain diagrams. Wrinkled because it's extensive enough in our evolution, so it has to be folded into the bony box of your head. When you look at the cortex, it consists of at least 200 different areas that can be identified in terms of function and structure. But the main thing is it's more or less the same. It's a 6-layered structure. And I think it's worth giving your listeners a view of how many cells there are in it and what that means. I said it was the most complicated material object. Well, in the cortex, if you pulled it out and laid it flat on a table, it would be the size of a large table napkin and about as thick. You would have 30 billion neurons, or nerve cells, and 1 million billion connections. That means if you counted one connection per second, you would never stop counting until 32 million years later. And that's just counting them. That's not calculating the different ways in which they can be connected. Now, to go to your question, what happened, in fact, in hominid evolution, or the evolution that led to human beings, was in a very short order, the cortex, particularly the front part of the cortex, the prefrontal area, as they call it, enlarged enormously. And that's really one of the most fantastic pieces of evolutionary hardware one can think of. And it's quite clear that that was, in fact, the reason for our intellectual capabilities and finally our ability to invent language.
Okay, well, some people say that the back of the brain is the oldest, and as mammals began to develop, they developed a social structure which required emotions and learning to interact with each other, and the center part of the brain, among many other functions, also includes emotions and social interactions, and the front part and the top part of the brain is the so-called thinking brain.
Well, here we are at this juncture, which, of course, you heard me reject before, namely, there is a debate that has gone on since the 19th century called the debate between localizationism, the fact that each part has a certain function, and holism, which says, no, it's the whole brain. Well, the truth lies in neither. The truth lies in the fact that the brain is a highly interactive structure, and the different combinations of interaction across all the different areas are what really count. So while an area can be necessary for a thing, it might not be sufficient. It has to interact with other things.
Okay.
So you don't locate emotions or consciousness in any nerve cell or place per se. It's a function having to do with interaction. So let's talk about that for a minute, because emotions, for example, involve a deep set of interactions between the more primitive parts of the brain, the back parts, as you've called them, and, say, the cortex. And it's the multiple interactions of all those areas of hormones and of molecules called neurotransmitters, which are the ones that make neurons fire and one neuron connect to another in terms of function. All of those play upon particular emotions in a great combination of different possibilities.
And what about structures like the amygdala, which has been in the news recently as people try to...
The amygdala is a portion of the brain which, in fact, some people have asserted is responsible for fear responses. I think that's probably too narrow. The amygdala is certainly involved in a number of things having to do with emotional reactions and warnings. Perhaps the best way to look at this thing is to say the following, that the brain, besides having all these connections which lead to perception and finally to signals to the spinal cord to give motion in our various muscle systems, there is a set of value systems, a set of systems that have evolved to sort of act as warnings or rewards. A good example is something that goes by a fancy name called locus coeruleus, the blue spot, which is in that hindbrain you're talking about. It's a very small number of neurons, but it sends out fibers all over the brain like a hairnet, and also like a leaky garden hose, so that if you hear a very loud sound, for example, this system will release something called norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter, all over, leak it all over in such a way as to change how quickly and how differently neurons or nerve cells fire. There's another one of great interest called dopaminergic system. That releases a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which is responsible for giving rewards. Now, all of those systems are inherited, and there are about 6 of them, and they interact in this complex play to yield what we call emotion.
Okay, now let's talk about comparing the brain to a computer. Some people say that the brain is not a computer, contrary to popular belief. There's no Windows up there. There's no Pentium chip. There's no programming. There's no software. There are no subroutines. Therefore, the brain cannot be a computer. But what are your thoughts?
I am at the forefront of that movement. I have been so since the early 1970s, and the evidence is overwhelming that it has none of the properties of what people in the computer business call a Turing machine, after Alan Turing, the great British mathematician, who wrote a theorem that said that he can show you with this theorem that he can carry out any set of effective procedures or algorithms that you can name as long as they're unambiguous. What he had to do is call upon a tape which had binary arithmetic, zeros and ones, and it could read and write or erase and move to the right or the left. And he proved mathematically, very formally consistent, that this machine could carry out any such set. So you might ask, why not the brain? Well, here's one of the problems. The world is not a piece of tape. The piece of tape must have unambiguous writing on it that instructs the machine. So the machine is an instructive system. The brain, in fact, is a selectional system. It already has a huge number of possibilities, and you pick amongst them to strengthen one or another, depending on your experience. The real argument against the brain being a computer is both structural and functional. when you look at the embryology of the brain, how the brain develops as a structure in an embryo or whatever, or in a fetus as it's growing, you see that neurons that fire together wire together. It's not genetic at all. It isn't prefixed. Certain things are, but most things are not. So every individual brain is indeed individual in the history of the universe, and in fact that's a non-trivial statement. But it's no way to run a computer company.
Okay.
And in fact, you can't really say you're going to be writing a program for a 6-month-old baby.
Okay, now at the opposite extreme, some people say the brain is a neural network, a learning machine that constantly rewires itself as it learns new tasks. Therefore, it requires no programming. It learns like a baby simply by having stimuli come at it. What are your thoughts?
Of course, that's equally extreme and not quite correct. The fact is there are genetic constraints which govern certain things that you do inherit, and which do limit what the brain can do. So it's not a blank slate. You just don't write on it the way you just said. It is a combination, and we can get to this, of this huge number of possibilities in which certain ones are fixed depending on your evolution, and certain others are fixed depending on your actual experience. But that requires a theory of the brain. Maybe we can talk about that later.
Okay, we will in a minute. But also the question of consciousness. People have, of course, pulled their hair out trying to define consciousness. People in artificial intelligence theory lean toward the idea that consciousness is a stream of images, a stream of sensory perceptions that hit the brain, and the brain associates certain emotions or conclusions with the stream of images that come at it. But that's how artificial intelligence people look at consciousness. But what are your thoughts? What is consciousness?
Well, the way I would answer that is to say that, first of all, the great philosopher and psychologist William James, the early part of the 20th century, who wrote this magnificent book, Principles of Psychology, perhaps gave the most clear-cut description for the first time of consciousness. Not a question of definition. It's a form of awareness, as he pointed out. And here's the most important thing. It is not a thing. It is a process. It cannot be embodied as a thing. It is a set of relationships and a process that occur. All right? And third of all, as we all know, it's private in the sense that it's linked to your body and not to my body. There's no telepathy involved. You, therefore, when you have a set of feelings, while you can convey them to me, I can't really know exactly what you're feeling because it's private and because it's connected to your brain and your body. It is also possessed of what they call intentionality. That's not like intention. It's the idea that consciousness is pretty much always about things. But that's not absolute because we talked about emotions. For example, a mood is not a thing, and consciousness involves moods. It involves thoughts. It involves feelings. It involves all those things. And the main thing is this, that it doesn't exhaust everything that you experience. It is modulated or changed by attention, as you know. And finally, the most important thing to point out about it is the curious combination of what's its unitary nature, namely, you can't just be conscious of, say, the microphone in front of you and nothing else. You're conscious of the whole room, the microphone, the feeling of the seat on your back, all of those things, the smells, all of those integrated things constitute a stream of what James called the stream of consciousness. It's unitary, but at the same time, it changes enormously. If you think of your high school graduating class, or you think of some physics formula where you first learned it, there's an enormous spread of possibilities. So it's both integrated and differentiated, and it's a system for making discriminations. That is a very important thing.
Okay.
It is not a system for governing your immediate, quick action. So perhaps I could give you the image of a concert pianist who's practicing a concerto. He takes out a certain musical phrase and he practices it slowly until it becomes automatic. Then he looks up another one. And finally he gets the whole movement. He does start with consciousness, but then it becomes unconscious, like riding a bicycle or typing, etc. at a computer. Now say he plays, and the conductor is going along very nicely, and all of a sudden the conductor slows the beat without warning. Well, here's where consciousness comes in. It starts to make discriminations. Hey, I better change this, I better change that. consciousness is not necessary for the movement of my fingers in the detailed sense, because I've already learned that. So
Okay.
it's the most remarkable property.
Well, if you look at the animal kingdom and you talk about the concept of self-awareness, and you put an animal in front of a mirror, not every animal recognizes that object in the mirror is itself.
To say the least.
Right. So what about the question of evolution of consciousness and self-awareness, especially in the animal kingdom?
I think we have to dissect those apart from each other for the moment. But let's put it this way. Consciousness as a field for experimentation, which is now happening for the first time. We're taking it a bit away from the philosophers. Consciousness as that kind of field is best performed in the largest sense on human beings, because we have language and we can report our consciousness. I'll get to that in a moment. But to come to your question, for instance, certain apes can, in fact, recognize themselves having a spot on their forehead. If you paint a red spot on their forehead, they'll gaze in a mirror and be intrigued by that. Monkeys, in general, will not have that trait. So people have concluded, somewhat rashly perhaps, that means that there's self-awareness. There's certainly the ability to connect their image and the distortion of the image by the spot in a way that other species cannot. So let me go back and say what I think about when evolution gave rise to consciousness. But of course, having said what I said about experimentation, it's very hard to prove what you believe, for example, that your dog is conscious. So let me say that sometime about 250 million years ago, a set of reptiles called thoracic reptiles were the precursors of both birds and of mammals. And at that particular point, a particular change occurred in the wiring of the back of the brain to the front of the brain that allowed this process of integration that I talked about to occur.